Our speaker today is Professor Mary Christina Wood. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Washington in political science. She then went on to get a law degree from Stanford. After a stint working for as a judicial clerk for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, she went on to work in the private sector for a law firm. Then in 1992 joined the faculty in the law school at the University of Oregon. She's received many awards for both her teaching and her scholarly work. Among other things, she was the founding director of the Natural Resources Law Program at the University of Oregon. She's co-authored 2 widely used textbooks in natural resources law and public trust law, and her latest book is Nature's Trust, and I believe she'll be talking about that a bit today. So thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody. It is a real honor. Can you hear me all right? Is this working, actually? How well is it working? It doesn't seem to be working on my part. I don't.
It picks up the...
Oh, it's for your camera. It's not for them. Oh, got it. Okay. We'll just clarify here. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so thrilled to be with you today. My topic today is climate and the law. And if I were talking about this to another group in another state, we'd have about 30 slides on climate crisis. But I feel I can skip all that for you because people in the Northwest really know what's going on. People in the age group of college, university students, and high school students, in fact, are freaking out over what's going on. And so we are going to talk about some solutions. Now, there is a point of reality we have to get through. And that is to say, we have to understand the nature of the problem to understand what our government should be doing in response and what we should be doing and what the law should be doing. So I will talk about the nature of the problem just very briefly to put it into perspective. And then we'll talk about responses so far. And then we'll switch to what does nature require for a climate response. I'm going to finish with a legal campaign called atmospheric trust litigation, which is outside the realm of statutory law. But it's a different room of the law, so to speak, where youth, university age and younger, are pushing for fundamental rights to a stable climate system that they can hope to survive in. So how bad is the problem? Well, in the law, we always determine the response by 3 factors: the extent of the harm, the gravity of the harm, and the urgency of the threat. On all 3 scales, if you think about it, climate probably hits the top. It is urgent, it is grave, it is unprecedented. If we follow business as usual, which is to say that we do tomorrow what we did today, the trajectory takes us to 9 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the end of the century. Now, if you look at young people's lifespans, they are going to live well into the second half of the century. Is this survivable? We've had about 1 degree Fahrenheit heating so far, and that is causing all of the incredible effects you've heard about. And so most scientists look at this and say it's probably not going to support the conditions that humanity needs for broad-scale survival. In other words, what you hear more and more, and I urge you to listen carefully to the news as the climate negotiations in Paris heat up next month, but you hear more and more that we are moving towards a planet that won't be habitable broadly by humanity. This quote probably captures it better than anyone. This is the former dean of Yale School of Forestry, James Speth, who wrote a book on this. If we keep doing exactly what we are doing today, even with no growth in the human population or world economy, the world in the latter part of the century won't be fit to live in. So in terms of the magnitude of the crisis, it probably couldn't be greater. The dangerous feedback loops add an urgency to the crisis that most people don't understand, and yet the law has to deal with this too. How many of you have heard of tipping points? Probably all of you, because of the feedback loops in nature. And so we've got a very narrow window of time in which to respond adequately to prevent feedback loops in nature from kicking in and throwing us into a situation of runaway planetary heating. So it is indeed a planetary emergency. As the former chief climate scientist for the United States said, James Hansen, and I'm going to read this slowly, it's a profound quote, "Failure to act with all deliberate speed in the face of clear scientific evidence of damage functionally becomes a decision to eliminate the option of preserving a habitable climate system. The point of all this is just to say that you've all been drafted. You didn't sign up for climate. I'm sure some of you were interested in other things, but you have all been drafted into this great project because of your age and because of your lifespan and the consequences you face if nothing is done in time. There is a way out, and that's called eliminating fossil fuels. The very promising part of this whole story is that this is a feasible route forward. Many localities are planning for 100% renewable energy, but if you look at the scale, of our federal response, the federal government has still not created an overall plan for carbon dioxide reduction sufficient to prevent feedback loops and runaway heating. There is the President's climate plan, which how many of you have heard of that? The President's Clean Power Plan, raise them high. And so that accomplishes about 1/5 of the reduction necessary just for the United States, the leading scientists say is necessary. At the same time, President Obama's administration is pushing fossil fuel developments aggressively, and this includes coal exports, natural gas exports, and oil exports. Here in this region, maybe you can't see that. I don't know why. This region has been targeted as the fossil fuel gateway, so to speak, to Asia. There are 16 projects for just Oregon and Washington. These are huge export projects of coal, natural gas, and oil. And these have been proposed in about the last 3 years. This is an onslaught that targets this region. Why? Because of our location. President Obama has pushed for fossil fuel development of Powder River Basin coal in the Wyoming, Montana area. He's pushed for fracking all over the place, offshore drilling. And to get all those fossil fuels out to markets in Asia, guess where you go? You go through the Pacific Northwest. So when many people focus on the Keystone Pipeline, which is that proposed pipeline to take fossil fuels, fracked fuels from the tar sands of Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico, that's really missing the point now. It's our region now really on the front lines of all this export policy. If you combine the 16 projects with the others proposed for British Columbia, there's a total of 26 projects. These are all in the report from Sightline Institute. It's easily accessible online. Sightline Institute is an institute based in Seattle that tracks all these projects. But if you combine them all, they would have the carbon bomb, so to speak, of 5 Keystone pipelines. Now, how many of you have heard of Keystone Pipeline? Most people have. And the reason most people have is because Dr. James, sorry about that. We have a little battery repair job after class. The reason you've heard of Keystone Pipeline is because Dr. James Hansen, who is the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies until just a couple years ago, said that if you put the Keystone Pipeline through, the carbon emissions resulting from that amount of dirty fossil fuels would be, quote unquote, game over for the planet. Well, now you're looking, while the nation was focusing on Keystone, all these projects were being proposed in our region, Oregon and Washington. And they carry, and British Columbia, and they carry a total of 5 times the Keystone. So this is a matter of great concern to the planet. In your backyard, you have the proposed Gateway Pacific Terminal at Cherry Point. This would be the largest coal export facility in North America. I know you all know more about this than I do, probably. But it would carry up to 48 million tons of coal per year. And it's the site of a 3,500-year-old Lummi village. We're going to come back to treaty rights in a moment, but first I want to explain, since I teach environmental law and since I've taught environmental law for over 20 years now, why isn't environmental law working? I mean, does anybody wonder about that? Does anybody sort of wonder why, when we're facing the biggest environmental problem on the planet, why your environmental laws aren't working and why instead they're pushing out export facilities. Do you have any curiosity about that? So I did too. And I wrote my book really to deal with that. And the first section deals with the problems with environmental law. And it's a complicated story, and we don't really have time today because I hope we can have time for questions. But if you break it down, there's many dynamics that influence agencies. Agencies have control over our environment on the state, local, and federal level. And so Congress and legislatures give agencies power to implement environmental laws. The environmental laws were primarily passed in the 1970s. They're the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. We could go on and on. There's many, many dozens. Okay, and then there's more at the state level. So we've got plenty of law. That's good news, right? The problem is that the laws give authority to the agencies to carry them out, and almost every single law, except for the Wilderness Act, allows for the agencies to issue permits to allow the very damage that the statutes were designed to prevent. Do you get that? So the statutes were all designed to protect the environment, but they had little exceptions that the agencies could use by giving permits where necessary. But instead, over the course of 40 years of environmental law, the agencies at every single level and across the United States, and even in other countries that have replicated our systems, have taken these permit systems and run away with them, such that issuing the permit is the norm, and the exception is not issuing the permit. So in virtually all of those export facilities, what you have are numerous agencies involved, many, many permits that the proponents have to get, but in every single case, the agencies are primed to issue the permit. Now, it may not be a permit, it may be a lease, it may be a no jeopardy opinion under the ESA, the Endangered Species Act. We're just going to call them permits because they all accomplish the same thing, and that's allowing damage. So is everybody with me on this so far? So now you must wonder, well, why are agencies doing that? I mean, who gives agencies authority? Well, I'm not going to go on until you tell me. No. Okay, the law does. Whoever said that knew. Who said that? Okay, follow-up question. So the statutes give the agencies authority. Who gives Congress and the legislatures authority to create the statutes?
Probably us.
Probably us. It is we the people. Every bit of government authority comes from us. And so I saw, some people murmuring money, lobbyists, and that is what happened. It's a corruption of the system, but in the end, the law says that we are a government of the people and we give authority to the government. So why has government gone astray? Largely because they have so much discretion under these statutes. And over the past several decades, even though you've got wonderful people working in many agencies, and I don't mean to denigrate the people in the agencies, but the institutions themselves have become captured. Now there's a whole body of literature on this, so I don't need to explain a whole lot, but they're basically captured by the very industries they regulate. How has this happened over time? Because industries have every interest in making sure that the regulatory environment favors them. So industries is part of doing business. It's called regulatory affairs. Every company, every industry has a division called regulatory, is this okay that I'm walking around? Affairs. And that's their job, is to influence agencies to get a good result. And so after decades and decades of pressure exacerbated by the money that feeds into the political system that pays for the campaigns for the governors and the president to appoint these agency heads, you can see how the system becomes captured over time. Well, the law has not dealt with this. And so the default is simply to say yes to permits. They don't say no to permits. Well, across the country, people are demanding systemic change. There are people in the streets, there are hundreds of thousands of people in this region alone writing letters to agencies, showing up at hearings, protesting, all of that. But in the end, we have to ask, what are we asking for? What should the people be asking for of the agencies that hold control and could deny these permits and could adjust course in our nation? So what do we ask for? We have to ask for some sort of measure that would achieve climate stability. Do we all agree on that? Do we want climate stability? We're in a situation of energy imbalance right now, and we're getting much worse very fast. So we want to restore our climate to stability. If you talk to tribal people, almost every tribal elder I've ever talked to or heard in a speech starts with nature's laws or natural laws. They talk about the laws of nature, what humans really don't have control over. And so if you think about that approach to the atmosphere, you have to ask, well, what does the atmosphere need to bring it back into some stability? Is everybody with me? So Dr. James Hansen, the scientist I mentioned before, compiled a group of leading scientists throughout the world, and they developed a prescription which you can easily access on the computer. Just Google PLOS1, P-L-O-S, and then 1. And it's a prescription basically to return energy balance to the planet. There's two sides of this prescription. I'm only going to talk about one. But the one I'm going to talk about is carbon dioxide emissions reduction. The other side happens to be drawdown of 100 gigatons of carbon through an aggressive regime of reforestation, soil improvements, mangrove restoration. You can leave all that aside because that's not as urgent, and it doesn't so much involve a citizen campaign. So let's just focus on the carbon dioxide emissions. Well, you say, well, how much carbon dioxide emissions reduction do we have to achieve? We all know we're spewing out too much carbon dioxide emissions, and methane too, and other greenhouse gases. But how much of a reduction do we need? So this prescription says we need to return our atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide to 350 parts per million. And of course it deals with the others too, methane and the other greenhouse gases. But let's just focus on 350. How many of you heard the number 350 as part of the climate discussion? Raise them high, keep them up. Almost all of you. And so that is sort of the 98.7 temperature. It's the equivalent of what our body temperature should be. Am I correct? Is it 98.7, something like that? 6. Okay, well, close. Actually, this is better than I thought, because actually you'd probably bring it to less than 350 to get back to the pre-industrial number, which was about 283. So we are sailing past 400 parts per million on our planet. This is a very serious problem because we're pushed into this energy imbalance that is dangerous. How do we get back to 350? Well, my concern is, how do you take this and bring it to your government? Can any of you imagine going into your mayor's office and say, hey, we are organized citizens, we're going to vote you out of office if you don't achieve 350? What does that mean to them? It means nothing to them. So you have to translate that into carbon emissions reduction per year. You have to translate it into something they can do. So if you had a high cholesterol, for example, you wouldn't go into your doctor and the doctor would say, I'm just so sorry, you're just going to die. It's off the charts, it's going up. Have a good rest of your life. They wouldn't say that. They would say, here's what we want to get to, here's a regime to bring it down, and come back in 6 months, we'll check it again. So that is what these scientists have done. And here is the prescription. The trajectory goes down to 350. And it calls for 7% global annual emissions reductions starting this year. It actually called for 6% starting in 2013, but now we're at 2015. Now, here's the problem. The problem is one of urgency. It's like compounding interest on a debt. The payment gets higher the longer you delay. So had your government, started back in 2005, we could have accomplished the same thing with a 3.5% a year reduction. Now, we're at 7%, which is twice as hard, at least, a year. Now, here's the shocking part, and this is why we are in a planetary emergency. We are almost at the end of 2015. Our job at some point gets impossible. Because we're talking about per year. Now, it doesn't have to be per year exactly. It could be a big down payment. It could be up and down sort of, but it's got to average out a significant amount per year. And the door closes on this at some point because of the sheer feasibility of accomplishing such radical cuts in a global economy. And so that is why we're facing a planetary emergency now. Now, this is nature's law. It's certainly nowhere in the law I teach, but it's carbon math, and it's not a negotiation process. If you look at this as sort of a rescue rope, and you are down 200 feet down in a canyon, and these nice rescuers came along, said, hey, we'll get you up, we've got a rope. But they only brought a rope 150 feet long. Is all their effort worth anything? Even though they're the nicest people, they're saying, so sorry, we tried so hard. Well, the legislatures and many of the elected politicians, if you ask them, what have you done on climate lately? They will say, and I know because I ask them all the time, they will, well, let me just take Oregon. They'll say, oh, we passed the clean fuels law. And they think that's a big deal, which maybe it was, but they have no concept of the math. They have no concept of the big picture and their proportionate responsibility for meeting this carbon math. What they need to be doing is accomplishing 7% per year. And we all know that in Oregon, the clean fuels is just a drop in the bucket of that. But you see, this goes against all of the progressive nature that we have, and especially politicians. They like to do things little by little and see how it works and then move forward. And so we're asking a lot for people to change their mindset, but it has to be done. So now I've told you the environmental law is not working. The agencies are captured. Now where do we go in the law? Well, there's two other rooms I'd like to just introduce to you so that you're conversant with them. One is treaty rights. We are here in the heart of Indian country in the Pacific Northwest. Every single tribe, there's a fishing tribe in the Pacific Northwest that signed a treaty written by Governor Isaac Stevens in 1855, has the same treaty right. There's about 16 tribes with this particular treaty right to fish off their reservations. How many of you know about this fishing treaty right? Oh, that's good. That's great. So we're here in Lummi country. This is a profoundly powerful legal tool. It is one that is rarely used because the tribes don't often put their treaty rights on the line. But the treaty right says that the tribes have the right to go off their reservations to all of their usual and accustomed fishing sites. And at those fishing sites, which basically, if you think about it, includes almost every stream in the Northwest, because the Northwest was populated and fishing, most streams did have usual and custom fishing sites, and along the coast too. And so at those fishing sites, the tribes have property rights. These aren't some statutory rights, those are new. These are fundamental property rights to take fish. And the treaty says that right will be secured by the US government. Those are profoundly powerful because of the interpretation that they've been given over time by courts. Here in your backyard, the Lummi Nation has treaty rights to fish at Cherry Point. Those are property rights. Those are the oldest rights in the region, except for the public trust rights too, which I'll talk about. Well, courts have enforced these over time. This region had a number of landmark cases and also, frankly, fish wars where non-Indian fishermen and Indian fishermen were embattled. Actually, we're not going to go there. It's too kind of complicated. But there were fishing wars over the diminishing numbers of fish that led to court cases that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And over and over and over again, time and time again, through the Bolt decision, which some of you may have heard about, and the Bologna decision down in the Federal Court of Oregon, the courts have upheld this tribal treaty right to fish. They've said that treaty rights are property rights. Treaty rights even carry in-stream water rights to protect the amount of water needed for fish, and they carry the right of environmental protection. Now, those are astounding rights, because if the tribes bring those to court, looking at the history of how they've been enforced, the tribes have consistently had enforcement in the courts. Now let's look to another room of the law. So we've talked about statutory law, which has failed across the board to achieve its purposes, although it accomplished some things. We've talked about treaty law. Now I'm going to go to the third room of the law. They're all out there to use. But the third room is the public trust, which I've focused quite a bit on in recent years. And the public trust is your right. This is a public property right. Just as the tribes have a treaty right, which is a property right, all citizens of the state of Washington, state of Oregon, United States of America, and even other countries have a public property right to resources that are essential to their survival. It's called the public trust. And this says the government is a trustee of natural assets. Now, how many of you are familiar with college accounts? College savings, college trust accounts. Okay, so let's say that, that you lucky person, you raise your hand first, your aunt endowed $1 million college account for you. Sweet. And what's your name? Chris, congratulations. And I was appointed as the trustee for that $1 million account. And I decided, hey, I've got all the control here. I'm going to go to Hawaii, and I'm going to take my friends, these 4, with me. Sweet. And we'll just carve out about, $100,000 for a nice 2-month vacation. Maybe even buy a condo with the money. So is there anything wrong with that, Chris? Chris, let me remind you, I am the trustee. I have all the power. I have the money, you don't. You're the owner of the money, but I have the power as the trustee. Do you think you could take me to a court of law? Yes. And that is the power of a trust. The beneficiary has rights to enforce certain standards against the trustee because it's the beneficiary's property, not the trustee's really. The trustee manages the property. And so with every trust construct, we have fiduciary obligations. And that is true in the public trust area as well as the private trust area. The only difference is that the public trust area deals with the assets that we all own in common. And the private trusts, of course, deal with financial assets and so forth. And so in the public trust area, what is important to know is that, number 1, you have rights. Number 2, these rights are separate than statutory law. And number 3, they are enforceable. Now, the difficulty with the public trust is that it is it's a benefit and a difficulty. It's a very old doctrine, and it's been on the books in every state in this country, but it has not been modernized as much as it needs to be for our environmental crisis. So what it says, excuse the numbering here, government is a trustee of our assets, present and future generations too are beneficiaries, just like Chris was of that college account. And government has a firm and enforceable fiduciary obligation to protect the natural assets. Back in 1892, a famous case called Illinois Central was decided where the state of Illinois legislature gave away the Chicago shoreline to a private railroad company. And this was shoreline the public needed for fishing, navigation, and commerce. And the court said, you can't do that. That's in the public trust. The public gets it back, and said conveyance of the shoreline would be a grievance which never could be law borne by a free people. And so this is part of our legal tradition. As applied to water in Hawaii, it is absolutely revolutionary in terms of rethinking our water rights doctrine. In a famous case in Hawaii, the Hawaii Supreme Court said water is owned by the people. Water permits must be judged according to these trust standards. They protect both water quality and quantity, and it unlocks private claims to water. Each permit has to be reevaluated to see if it is in compliance with the public trust. Now, this is a constitutional concept. It is below, it is more fundamental and foundational than our statutes. So what I have done is conceive of this application to the atmosphere. And I want to check, we have until 50, right? Yep. Okay. Yeah. And so to the atmosphere, the public trust applied to the atmosphere is called an atmospheric trust approach. And this is what it does. It's a macro approach in the law for trying to achieve government response to the 350 requirement, so to speak. The atmospheric trust claim envisions going to courts and presenting a set of assertions. Number one, that the atmosphere is a trust asset. Number two, that the governments are trustees that share the asset. Number three, the citizens are beneficiaries. Number four, there's an obligation to protect the climate system and the asset. And number five, key, that the courts can order government to come up with a plan to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to protect the climate system according to that scientific prescription I told you about. So the fiduciary obligation in an atmospheric trust case is expressed as create a plan, government, to bring your carbon emissions for your jurisdiction, the state of Washington, state of Oregon, state of Alabama, state of Pennsylvania, to bring your carbon emissions down by what percent a year? You tell me. 7. At least. Or what else, whatever is scientifically the best available science at the time. Now, does that make sense? In other words, government is not coming up with its own plan. If we had 20 more years, it might, or might not. It's had decades. We do have 3 branches of government, and I think people tend to forget that. There are 3 branches for a reason. We have Congress, we have the agencies, and we have the courts. And the courts are there to protect the fundamental rights of the citizens. The public trust presents a fundamental property right of citizens to have endured the resources essential to their survival. So if you believe you have a fundamental property right to an atmosphere that supports young people in the room, your survival later in the century, if you don't have that fundamental right, you better think up something good. Then it says you can take that to court. So I'm not a litigator, I'm a law professor, but this has been taken to court all across the country through a campaign called Atmospheric Trust Litigation that was is spearheaded by a group called Our Children's Trust. So everything I say is actually on their website for further inquiry. Our Children's Trust is based in Eugene, Oregon, and in May of 2011, they did something unprecedented in the law. They filed cases and administrative petitions in every single state in this country and in other countries as well, asserting the public trust right on behalf of youth to force carbon reduction according to the best available science. Every single case says the same thing, asks the same thing of the court or the agency. In some cases, you have to file an administrative petition before a court case. So these cases are all teed up. They're all moving through the system. A new one was filed in Pennsylvania just a few weeks ago. There's cases filed now in other countries as well. And guess what? Your case is the most important one right now. And guess when it was argued? 2 days ago in Seattle, Washington. So your case we call the Washington Trust case. My case in Oregon, it's not my case, I'm not involved in it, but ours is the Oregon Trust case. Now, your Washington Trust case is the leading case right now because the judge in Seattle has given a huge victory to plaintiffs 3 months ago or 4 months ago in May. In May, all these were filed on behalf of youth, so the youth are the plaintiffs, you understand, people your age and younger. And Judge Hollis said to the Department of Ecology, you were wrong to deny the youth's request for a rulemaking to bring down carbon emissions in this state according to the best available science. You were wrong to do that. Go back, report back to me. The case continues on because the Department of Ecology has not wanted to fulfill that obligation. And so 2 days ago, there was a court case, another hearing in that case in a Seattle courthouse. It was packed with youth from schools in the area, and it was on the news. And this is your governor. Do you recognize him? After that victory in May, these youth plaintiffs got the leverage from that victory to go meet with the governor and make their demands to the governor, who, by the way, wrote a book about achieving, do you all know about his book, Apollo's Fire, I think it's called, about achieving a low carbon or zero carbon lifestyle or economy in short order. Now, there's other victories as well. In the Netherlands, there was a huge victory ordering the government there to reduce carbon emissions radically, more than they had planned. There was just a ruling in Pakistan in September along similar lines. And in August, our Children's Trust filed a whopper of a case, probably the most important case on the planet right now, against the Obama administration on the federal level in Federal District Court of Oregon. So there's a judge in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, where I live, sitting on a case against the entire Obama administration and all of his agencies, challenging all of the fossil fuel export policy, but also demanding a plan on the federal level to reduce carbon emissions in accordance with the best available science. They have charged, after putting forth the evidence of congressional recalcitrance, they have charged, and these are very serious words, defendants, that's the government, have acted with deliberate indifference to the peril they knowingly created. If you read those court documents, and they're all on the website of our Children's Trust, you will see the future and the peril they are talking about because they have so much evidence from leading climate scientists. And you will also see the tradition of ignoring the problem as it has mounted now into an emergency. So given what you know about climate crisis, is this climate case, any of them, a typical environmental case in light of the extent of harm, gravity of harm, and the urgency of the threat? Yes, no? It's not like any other case you can imagine in the history of environmental law. The history of environmental law, is comprised of cases against timber sales or against dam operations or this or that. These are literally geared to saving the planet's life-sustaining resources. So the common law, it's often said, responds to the felt necessities of the times. The planet is on the docket in these cases. James Hansen, Dr. James Hansen, the scientist, says judicial relief may be the best, the last, and at this late stage, the only real chance to preserve a habitable planet for young people and future generations. The reason he says that is because of the very short time frame in which we need to have a wartime mobilization. Literally, people are saying what we're looking at is equivalent to a wartime level of mobilization like World War II. And so the climate recovery plans are really the only things that can focus the government's attention in rapid manner in a focused way. Not to say that, this requires a whole lot of other things too, but this is an important piece. So how can people and students support these cases? They can pack the courtrooms. They can demonstrate outside courtrooms to show judges that there is moral authority from the people to issue these kinds of decisions. They can get the press's attention. These cases have all been on national news. They've been in other countries' news. This is the Oregon plaintiff. She was on the Bill Moyer show in September of last year, and then I followed her in January on the Bill Moyer show, and you can look that up and send that around. What can you do? Beyond taking an interest in your Washington case, I think the most important thing to do, and I might end on this, is communicate your draft. If you've been drafted into war, you'd certainly start telling people, right? Well, you've been drafted into something called climate. And so communicate the emergency that we face in responding to this crisis. And the problem is that if you go outside, it's not going to look like an emergency. Driving over here, it didn't look like there was any emergency. We drove over. I got a sandwich earlier in the day. I turned on the water, came out of the tap. Everything functioned for me today. And so it's really hard communicating an emergency when it doesn't look like an emergency, right? And so I want to suggest that we have a choice. In this communication, we have to tell people you have a choice of emergency. We can choose this kind of emergency, which I guarantee we're going to have more of anyway. Or we can choose to respond to the urgency of the moment and create this kind of future. but it does mean living our life differently, because we cannot have any law or any carbon recovery plan face the kind of consumption that we have now. And so part of your effort as the generation coming up is what to do with this lifestyle that we have. This is the American lifestyle. And so I'm going to end with this. You have three choices. There's three realities out there, and believe me, I pick these up all the time because I speak about climate all the time. I guess I'll end on this slide. Many people out there are just doing business as usual. They're waking up, they're going to do tomorrow what they did today. That leads to inaction. Other people, and I tend to encounter these people in Eugene, they're hiding under tables at Starbucks coffee. They are so depressed. They don't realize, they think it's over. They don't realize we still have hope. We still have a window of time, but they're no better than the ones that are ignoring the crisis. They're not doing anything. They're just caught in the futility of their beliefs. But this is where the emergency response will come from those people who act using their unique talents and tools. So beyond citizenship, beyond taking an interest in the litigation, I want to end just by saying every single person is in this game, has skin in the game, so to speak. And every single person has unique talent to give. So for me, it happens to be law. I'm also really good at canning. I've taught myself how to do that. So I go around teaching people how to do that in Eugene. But you might be good at poetry. You might invent the next battery that's going to break the storage barrier. Someone else might figure out how to draw down carbon through soil methods. Every single person has a role, and that's what happened in World War II. Nobody stood at the sidelines. So in conclusion, I guess there's no time for questions, but that's okay. In conclusion, we're in an emergency, and I urge every one of you to claim your moment and to let me know when you've done so, because I take your stories forward to other places. Thank you so much.
Might want to stay around and ask a few questions. So if you have to leave, go ahead and do so. If you have a question or two, I'm sure we could squeeze a few in.
Okay.
Do you have a phrase solve the question up there?
Or not. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, when I read your book and when I read it in other places you've been that I always find myself a little bit concerned about, maybe this isn't putting it quite right, who's going to oversee the courts? Because we know courts can come to very wrong.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And you know what? There's no good answer. We do not have a perfect government. I'm so sorry. I usually do, yeah. So the question is, who's going to oversee the courts? The courts aren't perfect either. In fact, many courts are elected. And some courts in some states are simply in the pockets of industry because they're campaign contributions. So who's going to oversee the courts? So I guess I have two responses to that question. We do not have a perfect system. All we have is the three branches of government that we have. And so I can't solve that problem, but I will say that lawyers, expert lawyers, can take cases to courts that they feel are neutral or understand climate science. So for example, in choosing between the lawsuits and the petitions, I do know the Lawyers for Our Children's Trust thought about that carefully in 2011. And for example, I don't believe a case was filed in Kentucky and places, or now Texas was interesting though. They filed a case in Texas and that judge came out finding there was an atmospheric trust. So sometimes, but lawyers do a lot of background research on the judges, so they're careful where they file the court actions, and that's the best way to avoid a really adverse decision. Second thing is, the public trust has been bruised in the past by adverse decisions in many states, but it's like the little toy that keeps on ticking, or the battery that keeps on ticking. It just comes up again. The public trust is so fundamental that actually courts have reversed earlier decisions that minimize the obligation. That's happened time and time again. And so the third thing is the main problem of courts, the main worry is that they won't do something, it's extraordinary to find that they actually damage the trust in a really fundamental way. It's possible that you manage. So from a lawyer's perspective, it was rather brilliant of the lawyers for our children's trust to throw out 50 petitions and lawsuits combined, because you put all the eggs in different baskets, and then the federal case is different still. So suppose the U.S. Supreme Court came out with a very adverse decision, it wouldn't affect any of the state cases. Yeah, question?
So I live in Anacortes, Washington, right here.
Yep.
And it's a town full of environmentalists who care greatly about their children, and I think everyone is really excited about this law that's going on right now. And yet, there's a ton of people who are in the direct employ of the refineries.
Yeah.
And the refinery owners believe in climate change, and yet these are the people who are going to be impacted directly by fear of loss, economic loss.
Right.
Lose my job and not be able to support my children. So I'm curious if you can give me some good elevator pitches for talking, because I do
Yeah.
talk to people a lot.
Good.
How do we talk about this to those people?
Yeah. So one of the most important things about climate strategy is to combine it with all of the problems of society. So to combine climate recovery with job creation. And that's an easy sell to make in terms of the green economy. If you think about, we have to do a complete flip, a somersault, between 100% fossil fuels to 100% renewable within a very short period, maybe a couple decades even. That you cannot do, you cannot achieve that without massive employment. And so the hard part is that a person's security in their fossil fuel job, the writing's on the wall, that's got to end if the planet's going to survive. But you have to have some sort of alternative position, job, that these people can transition into that will be fulfilling to them, maybe even better for them. So in Hood River, I know quite a few unemployed people in the Hood River and Columbia Gorge area signed up for classes to become windmill engineers. And now the community college in Hood River is one of the main windmill training colleges in the country, and the Columbia River Gorge has windmills all up and down it. It's just exploding. So a lot of those unemployed people became windmill engineers and operators. But you do have, there's just no way to back out of the reality that the fossil fuel economy has to end if the planet's to survive. And so a short way of saying this is that you don't want policies that kill jobs. But you also don't want jobs that kill. And so that's the mess we're trying to get ourselves out of. Now, is government any help? It could be. It could actually flip the subsidies from the fossil fuel sector to the renewable energy sector. And with community colleges coming up with training programs, it could be incredible for many of the people that you're talking about. And maybe healthier.
The mayor's really into that, but it's hard in a small town. So.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Currently, a big topic is the carbon tax.
Yes.
We talk a lot about it, especially on campus. I'm curious what your thoughts on that are in regards to kind of a bridge to helping to move things along, or if it's basically just too soft of a policy.
Oh, no, it's not soft at all. So the question is about carbon tax. Generally speaking, there's two financial tools to achieve carbon reduction. One is called cap and trade, and one is called carbon tax. So the benefit of a carbon tax is that you have a fixed tax on the fossil fuels coming into the state usually, and it generates revenue for projects for infrastructure. It's very easy. You get out of this mess of the regulatory agencies. They don't have any discretion. It's a tax. It's a calculator. And so it's really easy to monitor. It's clean. There's not going to be a lot of leakage. With but you still don't know quite what it's going to achieve. I guess that's the real problem with it. The cap and trade is the agencies set a cap on carbon emissions. And then they allow carbon emitters to trade allowances so that the cap keeps coming down, let's imagine 7% a year, but that you give the market a chance to make trades. Now, the benefit of that is you have a certain cap if it works, if the agencies are going to actually enforce it. You know it's going to come down, in theory, 7% a year. The difficulty is agencies have an abysmal record of enforcing any law across the board. And so you have to write the law so tightly and have to have confidence in the agencies. Now, there was a bill in Oregon, and it will come back again. And I'm not allowed as a public employee to speak about active legislation, but this was past legislation. And I will tell you there was a cap and trade bill. It's called HB 3470. Again, may come back, I think it will come back in the next session. But it seemed pretty solid on the state level. In other words, it would force carbon emissions down in accordance with best available science. And if Oregon got a cap and trade regime going, my point to Oregon audiences, I used you all, frankly. I said, look, California's got this going. It is bringing carbon down remarkably. If Oregon passes this bill, Washington is going to come in line. So that's how I used you. Because I just think that the 3 states on the Pacific, we amount to, I think, the 6th largest economy combined in the world. And so if you can imagine Oregon coming on board in this special session coming up with big climate legislation, you've got the governor who wrote the book, Apollo's Fire. I don't understand what's, there's a lot of politics in the state, but basically people would look to Washington to come right up with some sort of scheme to do a similar thing. Now, it could be a cap and trade or it could be carbon tax. There are some issues with carbon tax, legal issues that I won't go into, but a lot of them can be skirted too by just redesign of the system.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So I'm impressed by the potential of this legal strategy for implementing real change. But my concerns are that the courts move slowly.
Yeah.
And they move fast enough to force real change.
Okay,
so I
so
can see this being tied up in court for the
sure.
next 20 years.
Sure. Most courts have moved very, very slowly, and they can move slowly. But you know what? They have complete discretion to move as fast as they want. They can prioritize this on the docket. They can treat it as an emergency. Do you remember the Bush v. Gore case? There was an election in the balance, and somehow we got the Supreme Court ruling within how many weeks? So courts, actually judges, can move so fast. And that is the reason why the judicial branch is necessary now, because there's no other branch that can focus the attention of the governing officials like a judicial branch can. So a judge can actually issue a declaratory judgment, which is a just principles, declaring principles, a 2-page declaratory judgment assigning the principles that I've outlined up here, signing the name, would be heard around the world within half an hour. It would literally get around the world within half an hour. People are waiting for any sense of obligation expressed by anyone in the United States of America. And so if you have one judge signing a declaratory judgment, leaving the relief for conferencing next month, having managing the remedy so that the parties come back into court and give reports again and again on their progress. This is exactly the remedy we saw in the Indian treaty fishing cases. So it is not unprecedented at all. In fact, it is organic to this region and to the federal courts of this region. So they can move very swiftly. They don't have to move slowly. But it's really, I want you to think of this, the public trust and the treaty rights, as a vessel. The vessel is sound. It is seaworthy, so to speak. A judge has, as far as I can tell, and this has been vetted by so many lawyers across the country, even the world, a judge has a vessel to operate through these stormy seas. But the real question is, will it turn on the ignition? Will it use it? That is hard to force a judge to do anything. You make the best arguments. What forces courts? We can't force them. But when a judge senses the moral authority rising up, especially from the youth, through letters to the editor, through press, through packing the courtrooms, through demonstrations outside, then the judges start to realize their role in protecting the fundamental rights, and then they may use their authorities. that vessel can go very fast. And again, I want to clarify, the judges would not create the plans themselves. The judge isn't going to say how you reduce carbon. That's your legislator's job. That's your agents, that's the other branch's job. They're the trustees. So sometimes I hear, well, we don't want a court telling us what to do. They're not going to. That's the job of the trustees. That's your government's other branch's job. But they have to come back to court and show that they are making progress, adequate progress towards climate stability goals. Yeah?
Maybe speaking from the futile and desperate side of me, but what if it failed? What other option is there other than atmospheric threat?
Well, yeah, there's no silver bullet. There's actually no silver bullet. As Bill McKibben says, there's silver buckshot. And so, so that's why I tried to end by saying, you know, this is my contribution on the law. I happen to think you probably can't get this project going without government. I might be wrong on that, but government controls all the infrastructure. And I think given the time frames we're looking at, this is the best way to get government on board. It's not the only way. There are local initiatives. You could imagine the federal government being irrelevant. Congress is irrelevant right now. I mean, it is. There's even law review articles talking about. And you can imagine that level being almost irrelevant, and the localities moving forward through citizen initiatives, creating resiliency projects. And Eugene, Oregon actually has this going now. We passed the most aggressive climate ordinance in the country that's calibrated to the best available science. And youth in the city of Eugene, organized by our Children's Trust, came to city council hearing after city council hearing, got them to do this. So life in Eugene, Oregon should look very different a couple years from now than now if this process keeps going. But the federal government still has control over the permits allowing all those fossil fuel projects to go out. So even though it's irrelevant to the solution, it's always relevant to the problem. Your federal government is pushing out major amounts of fossil fuels. And if that's not stopped, then it doesn't matter what's done on any other level, because that alone is enough to be a huge carbon bomb. So there, I want to emphasize, and I'll emphasize in my talk tonight, I'm giving a much more expanded talk tonight where I'm going to emphasize this. This region has leverage. And this region, meaning Oregon and Washington, we're different than other regions of the country. And we have leverage, and I believe the citizens of this region are prepared to use it. Why do we have leverage? Because the engineers of the big fossil fuel companies decide to put all their plans through our region. That's real leverage. And if those are blocked one by one through citizen swarms, I call them swarms, swarming the hearing rooms, swarming the streets, civil disobedience is happening all over the region. If those are blocked one by one, then I think we'll find that the fossil fuel mix, the financial mix, will start to cave even more. There's divestment. You asked what other options are. There's divestment. In the financial world, people are, yep, you're in charge of it here at Evergreen. At every university in the country, there are students trying to get divestment policies. And that means the school pulls its assets. It just takes a few dominoes to fall, and then all the rest must fall, because no university wants to be the last holding the fossil fuel investments. We want to recruit students. And we also want donors in universities. And there's going to be a time very soon when donors are going to say, I would like to donate to your school, but I don't want that to go into an investment that supports miserable conditions or even non-survivable conditions for the students. And so the donors compress as well. Yeah?
What's your assessment? I know it's early, but with the new government in Canada, you just mentioned that the government actually, our government, FERC, has the final decisions on this, pushing everything on the Northwest. But we also had a government in Canada that was pushing everything to BC. I mean, it was their announced
Right.
way of their modus operandi. And so now with this new government, we're getting double trouble here in Puget Sound and in the Salish Sea because they all want to come through here. All the Alberta crews, some of the Alberta crews coming down to Sherry Point right now. And you don't really have the Canadian complication in Oregon so much.
No, we don't. So everybody heard the question? Yeah. So what do you do about a Canadian government? In writing my book, I was astounded. I see this major shift happening. Our world used to be organized along sovereign borders, and then huge multinational corporations, there's a lot of literature on this, sort of hopped the borders, and they're everywhere, and they're sort of defining a lot of terms of life. But now the citizens are rising and forming alliances across borders against their governments. And so what I think you're going to find in the next few months even is if the regionalism of the Pacific Northwest grows vocal enough and includes a vision of Cascadia entirely to include British Columbia, and includes with that vision the native people asserting treaty rights and protecting their ancestral lands, which definitely is present in Canada as well as Oregon and Washington. If you have that kind of vision for this region that's never been announced before, I think it can be profound and exert the same kind of pressure on the Canadian government or the industries that we're exerting here. There comes a time when the uprising is so great, these projects can't go through. They simply can't go through if the uprising is great. And remember, Gandhi how many of you know of Gandhi's Salt March to the Sea? And, the British government had a monopoly over salt and was depriving the people of salt, which they needed for various things like preservation at that time and so forth. And Gandhi just started a march. This was the first public trust act, really. Not the first, actually, it was the Magna Carta probably, but, well, whatever. But Gandhi started this March to the Sea, and so many thousands of people joined him, they overwhelmed the jails. They literally asserted their trust rights to salt. And my point is that at some level, the protest rising in this region is so great that things will, I think the switch will be flipped.
Again,
it has to be.
People.
It's what?
It goes back to the people.
It all goes back to the people. Yeah, we can't look to government for solutions. We have to force solutions. Yeah, question?
In terms of, kind of similar to Anna Cordes' question, in terms of like, this week there's an interview with one of the Crow elders about leasing the coal right.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the people who is hurting and has been for, a multitude of decades, you just tell them SOL in terms of like a chance. I mean, for him it sounded so desperate in terms of a...
So the question is about the Crow... Yeah, the question is about the Crow Nation, which is deciding to lease huge amounts of coal on its reservation.
To me, it seems like, yeah, of course they're going to. Why? I mean, of course they shouldn't do that because it's, why would we be investing in something that's so little left? But I guess, what would you say to, how would you?
Well, the Northern Cheyenne are, of course, neighbors and fighting the coal development. So this is not a solidarity among tribes over in that region. The Northern Cheyenne are fighting as hard as they can against coal development. They've refused to accept money. They have a lot of coal on their lands. They've refused it time and time again. And here the Crow Nation is selling their coal with impacts to everybody. And so all I can say is that I've taught federal Indian law too, and along with environmental law, and I see for 20 years. And I see with almost every significant environmental issue affecting Indian country where the tribal council sells out to a developer or industry that's going to cause great damage to the reservation and to the surrounding communities. I've seen in every single instance a bifurcation between the tribal council and the traditional people or the people who actually live on the reservation. So what we don't see outside of Indian country oftentimes is the diversity of views because they're not represented in the press. There may well be, and I don't speak personally on this, I don't know the Crow situation as a personal matter, but there may well be people who are very opposed to that decision who will then gain the political momentum to oust the people who made the decision. That is a repeating occurrence throughout throughout tribal history since the Indian Reorganization Act. So all I can say is that this is not unusual. Many tribes signed up for nuclear disposal on their lands as well. The Navajo Reservation also has flipped back and forth over time, coal, no nuclear. And the politics can be very volatile. And oftentimes, the tribal council that made the environmentally damaging decision, though economically beneficial decision, is ousted. Now, that doesn't solve the economic problems because the federal government has put the tribes in such a position of compromise. And there is such desperation that, that's the real understory.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay. Thank you so much.